Welcome to part 9 of the Unobstructed Way. The individual is immortal, which includes definitions of time, space, and matter, the mysteries of quality and quantity of consciousness, and their relation to life and creation. Time and space. Stewart had come a long way. Quote, in my own recollection and experience, California was still a frontier. There were no paved highways. The main roads were sketchy wagon tracks. Secondary highways did not exist. In their stead were trails on which we rode horseback. Such a thing as a professional guide did not exist. And when you started, you stocked up for the duration, even to such things as horseshoes. There were no wayside stores, unquote. Stewart had grown up to become Theodore Roosevelt's friend, a best-selling novelist, and he crowned his happy marriage and creative life by exploring the mysteries of human consciousness with Betty. In the following melancholy observation, he seemed to confess that no frontiers remained. In Across the Unknown, Stewart wrote, quote, the restlessness that meets one on the far side of novelty had begun to whisper in my ear. Chi bono? To what end? That miserable, sneering question that awaits every one of us somewhere along the journey, unquote. Did Betty know what was about to happen? Her words seemed strangely prophetic. Quote, the pain of taking shape, the anguish of particularization. I feel almost agonizingly sensitized in my perceptions, and I know what the years ahead have in store for me in the strain of taking shape. I have no right to take more expansion. It would be like overfeeding or massed wealth, something damaging to me. I've had my share of the raw material of eternal existence. I have been allowed for years to experience the rhapsody of higher life, but now I come willingly to suffer the pain of shaping one little verse from the great rhapsody, unquote. As we have seen, Stewart fought against the inevitable, and he mistook the posthumous, massively enhanced sense of Betty's affectionate presence as the ultimate aim of their experiment. But he was mistaken. Their mission had only begun. Betty was just getting started. Searching for a vocabulary for concepts too elusive for words that have been made inflexible by familiar connotations, Betty reached back to the ancient Greek. At first, Joan's subconscious mistranslated the word as eros, sparking laughter in the obstructed and the unobstructed. But the word chosen or channeled by Betty to describe the unobstructed universe was orthos, a word in ancient Greek that designates what is right, upright, correct, or in Betty's interpretation, the truth with a capital T. The Invisibles explained, quote, now the term orthos simply means the true, constant characteristic of the reality, consciousness, unquote. Orthos, truth, with a capital T, manifests itself in the obstructed universe as time, space, and motion. But time, space, and motion are not experienced the same way in the unobstructed, because in our part of the universe, they are only the after effects of forces that are experienced directly in the unobstructed. We're very near Plato's cave here, where the world we know is made up only of the shadows of the reality we have forgotten. Quote, truth is the unobstructed aspect of the entire universe, unquote, Betty explained. Quote, truth is the true, correct condition of my unobstructed universe, the one standard thing, the norm of which all else is but a reflection. This does not mean that truth is other than in evolution. It is in evolution, unquote. Time allows for the evolution of the acorn to the tree that drops thousands of acorns. According to the invisibles, time is receptivity obstructed. We can only go one direction in time, and we have to keep going. But time doesn't work that way for Betty. It's the difference between walking down a street between tall buildings, seeing only what's in front of you, or flying overhead with a complete vision of the grid and of all the streets between all the buildings. Betty reported that we can control our experience of sidereal or clock time by use of what she called psychological time, and that this gives us a glimpse of receptivity. An hour of boredom or drudgery can pass very slowly, while an hour of fun seems to pass quickly. She also gave the example of dreams, where a dream that seems to encompass a lifetime can occur during a short nap. Betty explained, quote, "All that you think and do is received and remains in time. Though your physical bodies and acts vanish from space, research, invention, material catastrophes like earthquakes, uncontrollable by your free will, or the beneficence of a season producing big harvests, all are received in space as incidents that pass. It is in time that they remain, to condition and influence your present and the present of all coming generations. Receptivity is the essence of time," unquote. Betty elaborated and anticipated the online experience when she wrote, quote, "The best thing I can do to make you understand our apprehension of time is to liken it to a map. It is there. We encompass it. Time, whose essence is receptivity, is experience. It is all the empirical knowledge laid out for us to use," unquote. Edgar Cayce, theosophists, and other esoteric writers have mentioned the existence of the Akashic record, a vast archive of everything that has ever happened or will happen, that is composed of or is itself astral light. They say it can be consulted by enlightened souls or by mediums assisted by spirit guides. Betty continued, quote, "This does not mean that it is static. The future is there too. And if we have the impulse to pick out of it some particular potential, we can do so. The future is to us much as the past is to you. You can go back in history or emotion or research or memory and pick out any bit of empirical knowledge that you think will serve you," unquote. The space in pipes allows water to flow. The space in our doorways and windows and inside our rooms is where we conduct our lives. Space is unobstructed conductivity. Quote, "Space is not distance," the Invisibles explained. "Space is degrees of perception. Distance is only slowness in getting there," unquote. Betty illustrated what she called the elasticity of space. Quote, "Yesterday, when I looked at a pebble under the microscope, I looked down into a deep canyon of space," unquote. What appears solid to us, the limitations that surround and define our lives, don't exist for the unobstructed. Betty can move through all matter. If psychological time gives us a glimpse of receptivity, can psychological space do the same for conductivity? Betty uses the examples of memory and imagination. While you are sitting in the space of your room, you can imagine, remember, or dream a faraway place. In a sense, you are then in two places at once. Betty also asks us to consider the way we can be flown hundreds of miles in an amount of time that would have taken months on foot or horseback. The radio and the phone, the car and the train, all these inventions are steps up the ladder from space as we know it to conductivity as Betty defined it. Quote, you can speed up or slow down, not to the same degree as ourselves, but much more than you were able to do even 2 decades ago. You are beginning to control the ratio of time and space, sidereal time and geographical space. Don't you see that in thus discarding properties of the obstructed universe, they are actually endowing it with the characteristics of my state of being in the unobstructed universe? They are making it as nearly unobstructed as they can, end quote. Betty doesn't travel in the unobstructed. She simply matches her frequency to the place or person she wants to visit. This allows her to move as quickly as thought. Stewart compared this to projecting a film. If you speed the film up, the characters cross space in less time. If you speed it up even faster, the images will disappear into a projection of pure motion. When you slow down the film again, you restore space and time, and the characters, places, and story reappear. If there is psychological time and psychological space, is there also then a psychological motion that we can use to get a glimpse of this frequency? We are told that, quote, thought is psychological motion, end quote. Ever have a series of illuminating thoughts in a flash, only to find it takes you several hours to fully write them down or tell them to a friend? Or perhaps a thought has occupied you for a time and distance you had not expected. But frequency is much more than thought. It is the continuity of being, quote, habitual and persistent, Stewart explained. The I am is made up of frequency, unquote. Thought, added Lady Anne, quote, is an attribute of consciousness. Being an attribute of consciousness, it has frequency. It is received in time. And according to its creative potency, it remains in time, end quote. The difference between clock time and psychological time is that our own experiences of psychological space and psychological motion are more real to us, more intimately familiar than the real world operations of our bodily organs, for example. Reality is often a puzzling and mysterious place for us, where we are strangers in a strange land, profoundly uncomfortable. Aristotle once described the angst of soul in body as being like the Etruscan pirate torture of tying a captive face to face with a corpse. Our experience of psychological time, space, and motion, our thoughts and our dreams, are more comfortable to us than reality. There are glimpses of the unobstructed self shining through, however veiled by obstructed matter. Consciousness, not beliefs or feelings, thoughts or memories, but the ever-present core of awareness. That is where we find the threshold of the unobstructed self. Life, consciousness, and creation. Betty called life, quote, the one and all-inclusive reality in evolution, unquote. She said, quote, I wish that you could talk this out with someone of the bright youngsters at any of the electric research laboratories. It would mean something to him when I said that the radio beams, waves, electricity, light, all of which you are beginning to handle, are degree manifestations of only one reality, and that the highest manifestation of that reality, of which you are actually aware, is consciousness. The universe is the total of all manifestations of consciousness, unquote. Betty uses the word arrestment to describe how unobstructed beings create in our obstructed world. Arrestment is, quote, an incidence of frequency, conductivity, and receptivity resulting in manifestation or individuation in the obstructed universe. She elaborated, quote, consciousness is an evolution, therefore it is in various degrees. Each degree has its frequency, the individual rate. Each degree represents a specific manifestation, unquote. Betty uses the example of three slanting lines or light beams converging to intersect. Quote, you could perhaps illustrate it by algebra. Z plus Y plus Z equals a stone. X plus 2Y plus Z equals a weed. Plus Z equals a flower, and so on. X is a frequency. Y is conductivity. Z is receptivity, unquote. But what exactly is arrestment? Quote, call arrestment a suspension of potentiality, unquote. In other words, we choose to experience anything when unobstructed. But when we visit the obstructed, we can only be what we are, when we are, where we are. We flow freely like water in the unobstructed, but in the obstructed, we are like ice cubes slowly melting. It sounds like decisions are made in the unobstructed that result in lifetimes in the obstructed. We have metaphors for that moment. The actor takes a role. The artist has a vision of what to create next. The scientist enters the lab. We are then given a greater understanding of what the invisibles meant when they talked about the difference between quality and quantity of consciousness. Quality of consciousness, quote, that aspect of consciousness resulting in species manifestation as electricity, gold, tree, antelope, man, etc. In the unobstructed universe, quality is in evolution and therefore in degrees. In the obstructed universe, it is of fixed potential in its given degree. Quantity of consciousness, that aspect of consciousness in the obstructed universe, capable of and subject to development by the individual in evolution and therefore in degrees. So what we're after in life is gaining the most quantity of consciousness that we can get with our degree of quality, unquote. Quote, consciousness is the only reality, Betty explained. The unity of the universe and the all-pervasiveness of consciousness were also taught in Joan and Darby's book, Our Unseen Guest, where one of the most important messages from the other side was that, quote, form is an attribute of consciousness, unquote. Stewart provided an example. Quote, nobody would contend for a moment that Tony in the ditch and Einstein in the laboratory are of the same degree of quality. So when a man is born, he is a man because he is born from the human quality of consciousness. But he is born as kind of a man because he comes from his own particular sub-degree within that quality, bringing with him not only an unalterable humanness, but a fixed individual capacity, unquote. In other words, the kind of consciousness that is human contains a wide variety across the spectrum of humanity. But these are not static categories. As Stewart explained, quote, "So what can he do? Obviously, he can develop quantitatively. He can fill his capacity or come as near filling it or as far from filling it as his free will chooses," unquote. How does a soul develop greater quantity of consciousness then? Quote, "He does so by doing his job, undergoing experience, and assimilating that experience. In other words, by living earth life. The manner in which he lives it determines how high a mark in his capacity he makes. And incidentally, in any human being, there is more capacity than his best efforts are likely to fill. He won't spill over." Stewart returned to his example. Tony in the ditch can go to night school and support his crippled parents and get to be quite a man. Or he can stay in the ditch and arrive at old age pretty much the same Tony. Not quite. There's no one that does not accumulate some quantity, end quote. Stewart summarized, quote, "Both the Tony and an Einstein, each according to his quality, can and do grow here on earth intellectually, morally, and socially. Each builds what we call character. And we know that the extent of that building depends upon the personal initiative of each, on his individual free will." So, what is matter? But all these forms that consciousness creates are made of something. What is matter then? The stuff of the illusion that we call reality. Quote, "In the obstructed universe, matter is that arrestment of frequency which manifests itself in a three-dimensional extension," unquote. Betty talks about learning the skill to cause these convergences of receptivity, conductivity, and frequency that make obstructed experiences of time, space, and motion. These skills are called juxtaposition and intraposition. Quote, "Juxtaposition, the manner in which frequency, motion, variably collides with receptivity, time, and conductivity, space, to result in an arrestment, producing manifestation." Intraposition, as juxtaposition is arrestment resulting in manifestation, so intraposition is the relationship that obtains as long as that arrestment holds, end quote. In other words, consciousness creates forms by juxtaposition and sustains them by intraposition. When your consciousness juxtaposed the right combination of qualities, you got yourself a fetus to inhabit. So long as some part of your consciousness interacts with it, that creation will be sustained by intraposition. The invisible shared with the great poet and artist William Blake an idea of imagination as something more profound than fantasy. The true power of imagination is creation. In the preceding book, Across the Unknown, the invisible said of imagination that it, quote, "is the power of juxtaposition," end quote. One might say that we imagine ourselves into what we call reality. Betty warns us that it's an oversimplification, as well as a misunderstanding, to talk about material objects like houses or cigars existing in the unobstructed. Quote, "I have my landscape. If I wish to sit beside my stream on my bank of flowers, I can, by my handling of frequencies, produce an aspect of my matter that will give me a perfectly good support," end quote. This ability to manipulate the matter of your experience brings to mind lucid dreaming, wherein the dreamer becomes conscious of the dream and can have whatever invention or adventure he or she desires. Without all the obstructions of life which take up most of our time, what does Betty occupy herself with? Quote, would it mean anything if I said we fill up the gap caused by the lifting of obstructions by means of our increased acuteness of perception? Our range of registration is so much wider, unquote. Quote, I think I see it, unquote, Stewart ventured. Quote, if you take a 2-hour walk in the country with a dull person, totally uninterested in nature, it seems forever. But with a naturalist, say, who knows all about the birds and pretty flowers and things, those 2 hours, that's it, cried Betty, end quote. Unlike our own obstructed idea of geography, Betty is not only the prime mover in the creation she chooses to inhabit in the unobstructed, she's also able to experience simultaneous multiple perceptions unobstructed by time or space, or by the limits of the obstructed organs of human awareness. But Betty is careful to remind us that all these concepts merely provide glimpses. These are metaphors, not literal descriptions. Last words. What happens to those who choose to never explore their true potential, fascinated by trivialities or forced to live as they are told? What of those who exploit everyone they can with law of the jungle ruthlessness? What of people who never develop their talents? Those who ignore opportunity and discovery for a sterile and frail security? What of those who neglect their true responsibilities? Quote, free will creates its own hell with the widening of the arc of understanding, unquote, said Betty. Quote, no person of any sensitivity at all lives in the obstructed universe without having acquired by maturity some regrets, either slight or deep. Though generally those regrets come only momentarily in flashes. However, they should make it perfectly possible for anyone to understand the acme of regret that is the portion of the individual coming to this place of perfect understanding who has either shirked or passed by his earth opportunities, unquote. The importance of making the most of opportunities, along with thinking our way to prosperity, has long been an American obsession. This recurrent theme of American metaphysical religion has transformed some congregations of American Christianity into the equivalent of New Thought congregations. But Lady Anne gave the idea a different spin. Quote, there is a definite frequency that goes out from the minds of men of which they have not taken full cognizance, and that is thought. As a man thinketh, so is he. But I would go one step further and say, as a man thinketh, so is his surrounding habitation. So is his influence on the other frequencies he comes in contact with, especially human frequencies, especially those of lower degrees than his own. Nothing that happens to an individual is as important as what that individual thinks about it, unquote. If we fall into the vortex, we become an influence on those around us, the provocation to surrender to fear, futility, cynicism, the contagious swoon of forgetting. But spiritual contact can not only help us achieve the calm patience we need when we face the troubles of life, it inspires others. Lady Anne explained, quote, you go to your daily work with a glad heart and a free mind, happy in your consciousness, and the day starts with a snap, and you affect everyone. On the other hand, you do not feel so good, and down goes the whole day, and those in contact with you get the reflex. That is a definite application of your frequency, for it's a thing. A man can have private moods of his own, certainly, like sorrow, but this is true. that every time you overcome, you have strengthened your frequency and you have gathered onto yourself a bit more of the source material and the thing that is you with a capital Y, end quote. The Unobstructed Universe concludes with two appendixes. The first is Stewart Edward White's entry for Who's Who in America 1940. He'd appeared in Who's Who every year for 4 decades. The editors intended to list Betty as deceased, but then they encountered the book Across the Unknown. The chapter I Bear Witness moved them. They decided not to change her entry. For the first time in their history, a deceased VIP was listed as living. Criticism was met with a polite suggestion that judgment be withheld until after reading the Betty book and Across the Universe. Across the Unknown. The second appendix is an introduction to and appreciation of the Seven Purposes, a book authored by another friend of the Whites, Margaret Cameron. The Seven Purposes had been a popular metaphysical book in 1918. While the world was celebrating the end of the war that was to end all wars, Cameron issued a warning she received by automatic writing from the spirit world that a more terrible war was just around the corner, one that would decide the ultimate fate of humanity. She wrote, quote, Germany chose to follow the forces of destruction, and they will surely destroy her. But the forces she followed are uniting for a fiercer fight, more subtle, more deadly, more furious. The forces of disintegration are gathering for a tremendous fight. The Great War is one of the crises of civilization, but the battle to come still is one of the crises of eternity. Cameron's automatic writing not only predicted World War II, but also described the kind of people who would inspire and welcome it. Quote, the forces of disintegration are wily but fearful, bullies and cowards. When they are united in sufficiently strong numbers, fearless and unscrupulous, they fear the reawakening of the forces of progress in your life. This is the reason they gather now, to smite while the world is weary. Disguised as purposes of light, they hope for welcome. Because men have huddled together in fear, destruction threatens them. Because free speech has been debauched to fell purpose, free men distrust it, unquote. Those words were written in 1918, just after the Russian Revolution. A German corporal suffering temporary blindness from poisonous gas at the front line lay in a hospital bed. A year later, the army would hire him to make patriotic proclamations that condemned socialism and communism. He discovered he had a knack for public speaking. He was 15 years away from taking over Germany as the Führer. The world was 21 years away from the start of World War II. Stewart joined Betty in the Unobstructed, September 1946, just a few days more than a year after the end of World War II. He had lived without Betty's physical presence since its start in 1939. Betty left this world as the war began. Stewart, the tough frontiersman and war veteran, stuck it out for the duration, as we have seen, providing comfort where possible during a time of terror and loss. It would seem that the purpose the Invisibles served was not so much an experiment as a mission of mercy. That is the end of part 9 of the Unobstructed Way. Part 10, which will conclude the Unobstructed Way, will demonstrate the striking similarities between, first, Plato's theories and the Unobstructed Universe teachings, then the secret of the golden flower and the Unobstructed Universe teachings. We'll consider several reasons why they seem to be describing the same experience. Thank you for joining us. Please consider subscribing or giving us a thumbs up so that we know that you want more of these.